The music hall was buzzing with laughter and chatter as people gathered for the talent showcase. It was supposed to be a light-hearted evening filled with students and locals showing off their skills. Among the polished musicians and confident performers stood Anna, a quiet woman who rarely drew attention to herself. She lived a simple life in the small town, working at the bakery in the mornings and tending to her garden in the afternoons. Most people knew her as kind, but ordinary. When her name was called to the stage, the audience exchanged curious glances. Anna walked up slowly, her hands clutching a violin that looked older than she was. Some of the teachers sitting in the front row whispered and chuckled, shaking their heads. They did not expect much from her. One man leaned toward his friend and muttered, "This is going to be painful." The crowd laughed softly, their expectations set low. Anna placed the violin gently under her chin, her fingers trembling slightly as she tightened her grip on the bow. For a moment there was silence, only the sound of her deep breath filling the hall. Then the first note rang out, clear and haunting. The laughter that had filled the room only seconds before fell away, replaced by a stunned stillness. Her bow danced across the strings, weaving together a melody that seemed to reach straight into the heart. It was not just music, it was emotion turned into sound. Her fingers moved with precision and passion, telling a story without words. The teachers who had laughed before now leaned forward, eyes wide, as if they could not believe what they were hearing. Some students in the audience closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Each note carried weight and meaning, each shift in tone pulled them deeper into her world. Anna was no longer the quiet woman from the bakery. She was a master, commanding every ear and every soul in the room. The piece grew louder and faster, building into a storm of sound that filled the hall with fire and power. When it slowed again, her bow gliding softly, the audience could hear the pain and beauty of her life echoing in every note. It felt as if the violin itself was speaking, revealing secrets no words could capture. No one laughed now. They sat frozen, unable to look away from the woman they had underestimated. Even the teachers were motionless, caught between regret and awe as the music poured into their hearts. The hall was no longer a stage, it was a place of transformation where every soul present was being reshaped by what they heard. Anna closed her eyes and let the music guide her fingers, as if she and the violin had become one. And with each passing moment, the silence of the crowd grew heavier, more reverent, as they realized they were witnessing something unforgettable. The bow moved faster, now Anna's hands steady and sure, as though the violin had been waiting for this very moment. The hall filled with a melody so powerful that it seemed to pull at every corner of the room. People shifted in their seats, not out of restlessness, but because they could feel the music reaching into places they did not know could be touched. A woman in the back clasped her hands together, her eyes glistening with tears, as if the notes reminded her of something long lost. A young boy leaned forward, mouth open in pure wonder, forgetting to blink as he watched Anna create magic. The teachers who had once smirked were silent now, their faces pale, their eyes locked on her every move, as if afraid they would miss even a single note. The melody soared, rising higher and higher, until it felt as though the roof of the hall could no longer contain it. Anna played with her eyes closed, completely lost in the sound, her body swaying gently with each phrase. The strings cried out with sorrow, then whispered with tenderness, then thundered with strength, each shift weaving a story that left the audience breathless. Every person in the room felt as though the music was speaking directly to them, carrying their fears, their joys, their regrets, and their hopes. When the piece slowed again, the silence in the hall was so deep it was almost heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath together. Anna's bow hovered over the strings for a moment, then descended again, drawing out notes so delicate they felt like whispers in the dark. Some people closed their eyes, unable to bear the intensity of the emotions that swelled within them. The air itself seemed charged, every sound, every pause wrapping the crowd tighter into her spell. Anna's hands never faltered, her movements steady, graceful, and filled with purpose, as though she had been waiting her whole life for this moment. The longer she played, the more the audience forgot about the woman they had doubted and laughed at earlier. Now she was no longer Anna from the bakery, she was Anna the musician, the storyteller, the master of the stage. Would you like me to continue by showing how the music pushes the audience into an overwhelming wave of emotion where they cannot hold back their reactions any longer? The melody swelled again, filling every corner of the hall like a rising tide, and no one could escape its pull. Anna leaned into the violin, her bow gliding with such force that the sound seemed to shake the very walls. People gripped the edges of their seats, their knuckles, white as though holding on would steady the emotions flooding through them. A man in the front row pressed his hand to his chest, his lips trembling as if the music had unlocked something hidden deep inside his heart. Children who had been restless earlier now sat perfectly still, their wide eyes fixed on Anna as though they were watching something beyond human. The teachers who once mocked her shifted uncomfortably, their pride cracking under the weight of the truth they could no longer deny. One of them lowered his head, unable to meet the eyes of those around him, ashamed at how quickly he had judged. The notes rose higher still, dancing through the air like fire sparks, wild and uncontrollable, yet breathtaking in their beauty. Anna's face glowed in the soft light, sweat glistening on her brow, but her hands never faltered, her soul pouring out through every stroke of the bow. The sound became a storm, then a whisper, then a cry of triumph that made the audience feel as though they were standing on the edge of something eternal. Some covered their mouths, trying to stifle sobs, while others let their tears fall freely, overwhelmed by the raw power of what they were hearing. The hall was no longer just a room with walls and chairs. It had transformed into a sacred space, shaped by the music itself. Every heartbeat in the room seemed to beat in rhythm with Anna's playing, as if she had reached into each chest and tied them all together with invisible strings. And still she played the violin, singing with a voice that was not her own, but belonged to something far greater. Do you want me to keep building the scene into the moment when Anna's performance reaches its breathtaking peak and the entire room breaks into a reaction they cannot hold back? The final stretch of the melody poured out of Anna like a river breaking free from its banks. Her bow moved faster and faster, the strings crying out with a sound that felt both fierce and tender. The audience leaned forward, holding their breath as though afraid that even the smallest sound would shatter the fragile beauty that filled the air. A woman in the back clutched her scarf to her mouth, her shoulders shaking as tears rolled down her cheeks. The children were no longer restless. Instead, they seemed lost in wonder, their eyes wide as they listened to something they could not yet explain but knew they would never forget. The teachers sat frozen, their earlier laughter now replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a confession of their guilt. One of them covered his face with his hands, another simply stared at the floor, unable to lift his gaze toward Anna. And still Anna played, her fingers sure, her heart steady, her music rising like a bird that had been caged too long and finally found its freedom. The notes filled the hall, spilling into every corner, wrapping around every soul, leaving none untouched. Some people pressed their hands together as if in prayer, others closed their eyes, letting the music carry them to places they had never been. The sound softened until it was a whisper, a fragile thread of sound that seemed ready to break, but held strong. It was not just music anymore, it was truth, it was memory, it was every unspoken dream tied into one. The silence that followed between each fading note grew heavier and heavier until it felt as if time itself had paused, waiting for her final stroke. Anna's chest rose and fell, her eyes closed as if she too was somewhere far away, following the music where it led. Would you like me to continue building the performance toward the final breathtaking silence when every person in the hall is left unable to move or speak? The bow slowed as Anna guided the last trembling notes into the air. Her eyes were still closed, her head tilted slightly, as though she was listening to something only she could hear. The final sound lingered like the echo of a whisper clinging to the walls before it gently faded into silence. No one moved, not a chair, not a breath, not a cough. It was as if the entire hall had been captured in the spell of her music, suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Then slowly, she lowered the violin, her hands resting softly against the worn wood as though it were a dear friend. Her shoulders relaxed, her breath steadied, and she opened her eyes to see the sea of faces staring back at her. Some still looked stunned, their mouths parted as if searching for words that would not come. Others had tears shining in their eyes, glistening under the soft lights. The children clung to each other, whispering in hushed voices, as if afraid to break the sacred quiet that had settled over them. At the back of the hall, an elderly man wiped his eyes with a trembling hand, whispering something under his breath that no one else could hear. The teachers who had mocked her at the start sat stiff in their chairs, their pride stripped away by the undeniable truth they had just witnessed. They could not meet her gaze, their faces pale, their lips pressed tightly together as if admitting defeat without speaking a word. Anna stood quietly, letting the weight of the silence speak louder than anything she could have said. The violin still in her hand seemed to glow in the soft light, carrying with it the echoes of all the notes she had poured from her heart. Would you like me to show how the audience finally breaks that silence with overwhelming reaction, or keep the moment stretched with the stillness holding everyone in awe? The stillness hung heavy in the room as though time itself was unsure whether to move forward. Anna stood calm, her fingers brushing the violin, as if she could still feel the vibrations lingering in the strings. The audience shifted, but no one dared to speak, yet the air trembled with the weight of emotions unspoken. Finally, from somewhere in the crowd came the sound of a single clap, soft, hesitant, like the breaking of fragile glass. It was followed by another, then another, until the hall erupted into thunderous applause that rolled like a storm across the room. The children were the first to rise, leaping from their seats, clapping with wide eyes and joyous laughter. Their voices rose in excited shouts as they pointed at Anna, their little hands waving high in the air. The parents followed their applause, swelling with pride and admiration, filling every corner of the hall. Even the teachers who had mocked her earlier were forced to stand, their hands moving awkwardly as they clapped against their own shame. Anna did not bow, she only smiled faintly, her eyes soft with gratitude, as if she were sharing the moment with the violin itself rather than claiming it for herself. The elderly man in the back stepped forward, leaning heavily on his cane, his eyes fixed on her with a knowing look. He stopped just a few steps from the stage and whispered softly for her alone to hear. "You play like someone who carries stories inside their soul." Anna met his gaze, and for a moment it felt as if the two of them shared a secret that belonged only to them. The applause continued like waves, crashing again and again, each louder than the last, as if the crowd feared silence would rob them of the magic they had just witnessed. Do you want me to carry the story toward what happens after the performance, when people start approaching Anna personally, or keep building the scene inside the hall with the crowd still overwhelmed? One by one, people began to approach Anna when the applause finally started to soften. A young girl with braids stepped forward, clutching a small notebook to her chest, her eyes wide with admiration. She looked up at Anna and whispered shyly, "I want to play the violin like you someday." Anna bent down and smiled, her voice gentle and warm. "You already can. All it takes is to listen to your heart." The girl nodded tightly, her cheeks glowing as if Anna had given her the key to a secret world. Parents gathered around next, their voices filled with awe, asking where Anna had learned to play and why no one had ever heard her before. But Anna only smiled at their questions, her silence carrying a quiet mystery that made them lean closer. The teachers stood back, uncertain, ashamed to face her, but unable to tear their eyes away from the woman who had shattered their doubts in a single moment. The elderly man, still nearby, tapped his cane softly on the floor, and the sound drew every eye toward him. He looked at the teachers, then at the parents, before finally resting his gaze on Anna again. He said slowly, as though each word carried weight, "This hall has not heard music like that in many years, perhaps not in my lifetime." Anna lowered her eyes humbly, yet the room still seemed to revolve around her, as though the violin had made her the center of a gravity no one could escape. Even the children, who usually grew restless, were quiet, watching her with shining faces, as though they did not want to miss even a breath of her presence. The silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with awe, curiosity, and a sense of wonder that clung to every corner of the hall. Would you like me to take the story into what happens when Anna is invited to return again to play, or when someone important makes her an unexpected offer? The head teacher finally stepped forward, clearing his throat, though his voice shook when he spoke. "Anna, your performance was extraordinary," he said, though his tone carried both awe and a trace of regret. "We must ask you to return to our school again. The students could learn so much from you." Anna looked up at him, her calm expression never wavering. She did not rush to answer. Instead, she let the silence linger the same way she had allowed her music to breathe. The students leaned forward, their eyes sparkling, some even clutching their notebooks, as if ready to capture her every word. Finally, Anna replied softly, "I did not come here to teach. I only came because you asked me to play, and because music has always lived inside me." The head teacher nodded, but his face showed his struggle. He had underestimated her once, and now he seemed desperate to make up for it. Then a man in a dark suit entered from the back of the hall. His presence carried authority, and his eyes locked onto Anna immediately. He was the director of the city orchestra, a figure many in the hall recognized instantly. Whispered voices rippled through the crowd as his name passed from ear to ear. He walked closer, each step echoing on the wooden floor. Then he said in a firm but respectful tone, "Anna, the world deserves to hear your music, not just this room." The hall grew still again, as everyone waited to see how she would respond. Anna held her violin gently, as though it were an extension of her soul. She tilted her head slightly, and her eyes seemed to drift somewhere far beyond the walls of the school hall. Her voice came quiet but clear. Music is not about the world hearing it, it is about the heart that needs it most. The director paused, studying her words. The teachers stood frozen. The children clutched their breath, as though the moment itself was too fragile to disturb. And still Anna stood with her violin, calm and unshaken, as if she belonged not just in that room, but in the very air that surrounded them. Do you want me to continue by showing what the director does next, perhaps offering her a chance that will test her belief in playing only for the heart? The director slowly stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Anna. His voice softened, as if he too had been moved by her words. "You are right, Anna, music is for the heart, but sometimes the hearts of many need one voice to guide them." The teachers shifted uncomfortably, some clearly ashamed that they had mocked her earlier. The students leaned in even more, their curiosity growing with every word. Anna stayed silent, her fingers brushing lightly against the strings of her violin. The faint sound echoed in the quiet hall like a whisper of what could come. The director reached into his coat and pulled out a small envelope. He placed it gently on the edge of the stage. "This is an invitation," he said, "to perform at the city concert hall in front of thousands of people. The choice is yours." Gasps filled the hall. The students stared wide-eyed. The teachers exchanged nervous glances. Some looked envious, others amazed. Anna looked down at the envelope, but did not touch it. Her eyes instead drifted back to the children. Their faces were glowing with wonder and hope, as if they had seen something they never thought possible. She smiled softly. The sound of children believing in music meant more to her than the applause of strangers. Then she lifted her violin again. Her bow hovered above the strings, and the children instantly hushed, as though they already knew magic was about to return. The director stood quietly waiting. He did not push her, only watched with respect, as if realizing that her answer would not come in words but in music. Anna closed her eyes and let the first note spill into the air. It was gentle, almost like a secret shared with the walls themselves. The note lingered, then melted into another and another, until the hall was once again wrapped in her sound. This time the music carried something deeper. It was not just a melody, it was a conversation with every soul in the room. The director felt his chest tighten, the teachers felt tears sting their eyes, and the children swayed, as though carried by invisible waves. Anna played as though the violin had been waiting its entire life to speak, and finally, it had found the courage. The director clenched the envelope tighter in his hand, but he did not interrupt. He knew that no paper, no stage, no promise could equal what was happening in that very moment. Do you want me to continue showing how the children react after this performance and how Anna's music begins to change even the teachers who once doubted her? The final note lingered in the air like a breath held too long before it finally faded into silence. No one moved for a moment. The hall felt heavy and light at the same time, as if every heart had been lifted out of the room and placed gently back again. Then the applause came. It was not polite or forced, it was raw, it was powerful. The children clapped until their hands ached. The teachers who once mocked her stood and cheered with tears running down their cheeks. The director lowered his head in respect, clutching the envelope to his chest. He knew now that he did not need to offer her a stage. She already had one right here, where it mattered most. Anna lowered her violin and smiled at the children. Their faces shone with hope and wonder. They had seen that music was not just for the gifted or the famous, but for anyone brave enough to let their heart speak. She bowed her head humbly, and without another word, she walked off the stage, leaving the echo of her melody behind. And though she left in silence, the sound of her violin would stay in that hall forever, carried in the memories of every soul who heard it that day.